Every single day, roughly $6.5 trillion changes hands on global currency markets. The United States dollar sits at the center of nearly every one of those transactions. Oil is priced in it. Gold is measured against it. When a farmer in Brazil sells soybeans to a buyer in Shanghai, chances are the deal is settled in American dollars, even though neither party speaks English. It is the language of money itself. But here is something most people never stop to think about. The dollar has only held this position for about 80 years. In the grand sweep of human civilization, that is barely a blink. Before 1944, the year the dollar was formally crowned at a secluded hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire, the world ran on entirely different currencies. And before those currencies, there were others still. The story of what the world used as money before the dollar is not just a story about coins and banknotes. It is a story about empires, about wars, about the rise and fall of entire civilizations, and about the terrifying fragility of the systems we all take for granted. So, let us go back, way back, to a time when the dollar did not exist, when the United States was not even a country, and when the center of global finance was not New York or Washington, but a narrow cobblestone street in Amsterdam, a silver mine in the mountains of Bolivia, and a small island nation off the coast of continental Europe that believed its empire would never end. To understand what came before the dollar, you first have to understand something fundamental about money itself. A reserve currency is not just popular money. It is the money that other countries trust enough to hold in their vaults. It is the money that international contracts are written in. It is the money that settles debts between nations. And throughout history, this role has never been permanent. It is always moved, always shifted, always followed the tides of power. The pattern is remarkably consistent. A nation rises through trade and military strength. Its currency gains trust. Other nations begin holding that currency in their reserves. The currency becomes dominant. And then, slowly, through wars, debt, overreach, or simply the emergence of a stronger rival, trust erodes. The currency fades and a new one takes its place. Over the last 5 centuries, roughly 6 currencies have held this position. The Portuguese real, the Spanish dollar, the Dutch guilder, the French franc, the British pound sterling, and finally, the American dollar. Each one tells a story about power, innovation, and eventual decline. And each transition came with enormous consequences for ordinary people who had no say in the matter. Let us start with what might be the most underappreciated chapter in monetary history. A coin so influential that it literally gave the modern dollar its name. In 1497, the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, fresh off the completion of the Reconquista and the funding of Columbus's voyages to the Americas, introduced a monetary reform that would reshape global commerce for the next 3 centuries. They standardized a silver coin called the real de a ocho, which translates roughly to a piece of 8. Each coin weighed about 25.5 grams of fine silver, and its purity and consistency were remarkable for the era. Now, on its own, a well-minted silver coin is just a piece of metal. What made the Spanish dollar extraordinary was what happened next. When Spanish conquistadors began extracting staggering quantities of silver from the mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia and from the mines of Zacatecas and Guanajuato in Mexico, they did not just enrich the Spanish crown. They flooded the entire world with a single, standardized, universally trusted coin. Think about what that means. In the 1500s and 1600s, there was no internet, no wire transfers, no central banking system linking nations together. Trade happened physically. Ships carried goods across oceans, and those goods had to be paid for with something tangible. The Spanish piece of 8 became that something. It circulated not just in Europe, but across the Philippines, throughout China, across the Ottoman Empire, in the ports of India, and deep into the markets of Southeast Asia. It was the first truly global currency. China in particular became an enormous sink for Spanish silver. The Ming dynasty had adopted silver as the basis of its tax system, and the demand was insatiable. Spanish galleons carried tons of silver across the Pacific from Acapulco to Manila, where Chinese merchants exchanged it for silk, porcelain, and spices. Many surviving Spanish dollars from this era still bear tiny stamped marks called chop marks, little symbols punched into the coin by Chinese merchants to verify its authenticity and silver content. These marks are physical evidence of a transcontinental monetary system that existed centuries before anyone dreamed of a Federal Reserve. The sheer volume of silver flowing out of the Americas was staggering. The mines at Potosi alone, perched high in the Andes at an altitude that left workers gasping for air, produced an estimated 60% of all the world's silver during the second half of the 1500s. The human cost was horrific. Indigenous laborers and enslaved Africans were forced into the mines under a brutal system of conscripted labor called the maita. Thousands died underground, in the darkness, extracting the metal that would grease the wheels of global commerce. The silver that emerged from their suffering did not stay in Spain. It radiated outward along trade routes that spanned every inhabited continent, creating the first truly interconnected global economy centuries before anyone used the word globalization. The piece of eight was so dominant, so trusted, and so widely circulated that when the United States declared independence and needed to create its own currency, the founders did not start from scratch. Alexander Hamilton ordered a random selection of worn Spanish dollars to be weighed at the treasury, and the average weight became the basis for the new American dollar. The Coinage Act of 1792 set the United States dollar at 371,25 grains of pure silver, directly mirroring the Spanish piece of eight. Even the dollar sign itself, that familiar S with a line through it, is believed by some scholars to trace back to the Pillars of Hercules depicted on Spanish colonial coins, with the S-shaped banner reading plus ultra wrapped around them. So the next time someone tells you the dollar is the natural currency of the world, remember this. The dollar was born as an imitation of a Spanish coin. It inherited a legacy. It did not invent one, but Spain's monetary dominance did not last forever. By the early 1600s, the center of financial gravity was already shifting northward to a small waterlogged republic that had no king, no silver mines, and no vast colonial armies, but that possessed something far more powerful: financial innovation. The Dutch Republic in the 17th century was, by any conventional measure, an unlikely superpower. It was tiny, it was flat. Much of its land had been literally reclaimed from the sea, and yet, during what historians call the Dutch Golden Age, this soggy little republic became the wealthiest and most commercially advanced nation on earth. And at the heart of that transformation was a currency and a set of financial institutions that changed the world forever. In 1609, the city of Amsterdam established a Wissel Bank, the Bank of Amsterdam. Now, to modern ears, a bank does not sound revolutionary, but you have to understand the chaos that preceded it. In the early 1600s, hundreds of different coins from dozens of countries circulated through Amsterdam's markets. Spanish reals, German thalers, French écus, Venetian ducats, all with different weights, different purities, and different values. Conducting business was a nightmare of conversion and trust. The Bank of Amsterdam solved this by creating something entirely new. Merchants could deposit their coins at the bank, which would assay them, determine their actual metal content, and then credit the depositor with a standardized unit of account called the bank guilder. These bank guilders could then be transferred from one account to another through simple bookkeeping entries. No physical coins required. For the first time in history, large commercial transactions could be settled by a pen stroke in a ledger, rather than by lugging chests of metal across a canal. This was revolutionary. The bank guilder became in effect one of the world's first forms of stable, institutionally backed money. Adam Smith himself devoted extensive passages in The Wealth of Nations to explaining how the system worked. The French economist Lucien Guillard called it the European guilder, recognizing its role as the continent's reference currency. And the Wissel Bank maintained near-perfect backing of its deposits for almost 2 centuries, building a reputation for reliability that made Amsterdam the undisputed financial capital of the Western world. But the Dutch did not stop at banking. In 1602 they created the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, the world's first publicly traded corporation. For the first time, ordinary citizens could buy shares in a commercial enterprise and trade those shares freely on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first stock exchange. This was not just a business innovation, it was a complete reinvention of how capital could be raised, distributed, and multiplied. The VOC did not need a king's treasury to fund its expeditions. It had something better, the collective wealth of thousands of individual investors, all betting on the future. At its peak, the VOC was worth an estimated $7.9 trillion in today's money, making it the most valuable company in history by a considerable margin. It had its own private army, its own navy, the authority to sign international treaties, and the power to govern entire territories. And the currency that lubricated this entire machine, the Dutch guilder, became the world's dominant reserve currency for much of the 17th and early 18th centuries. The guilder's reign coincided with an era of extraordinary Dutch influence. Dutch merchants built trading networks stretching from the Spice Islands of Indonesia to the fur markets of North America. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company founded New Amsterdam at the southern tip of modern-day Manhattan. The settlement's layout, its organized streets, its commercial customs, its legal structures, all reflected the Dutch approach to business. When the British took it over in 1664 and renamed it New York, they did not wipe the Dutch influence away. They kept the commercial infrastructure because it worked. The financial DNA of Amsterdam was quietly woven into the foundation of what would eventually become the financial capital of the modern world. But like every empire before it, the Dutch Republic eventually overextended. Costly wars against England and France drained the treasury. The very financial innovations that had made the Dutch powerful were adopted and improved upon by their rivals. By the mid-1700s, the guilder's dominance was fading, and the center of financial power was shifting once again, this time to France. Now, France's role as a monetary power is often overlooked in the English-speaking world, but it is crucial to this story. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte introduced the franc germinal, a coin struck to exacting standards, 4.5 grams of silver or 0.29 grams of gold per franc. Napoleon was not just a military genius, he was obsessed with order, with systems, with standardization. And his monetary reform gave France one of the most stable currencies in Europe for more than a century. The franc's influence extended far beyond France's borders. In 1865, France, Belgium, Italy, and Switzerland formed the Latin Monetary Union, one of the most ambitious attempts at monetary integration before the euro. Member nations agreed to mint their coins according to the French standards at a fixed ratio of 15.5 silver coins to 1 gold coin. Greece, Spain, Romania, Bulgaria, Venezuela, Peru, and Colombia all eventually adopted or closely aligned with this system. For a brief window in the 19th century, the French franc was the closest thing Europe had to a unified currency. But the franc's ambitions were always constrained by a fundamental reality. France was a continental power, not a maritime one. Its trade networks, while extensive, never matched the global reach of its island neighbor across the English Channel. And it was that neighbor, Great Britain, that would build the most dominant reserve currency the world had ever seen before the dollar. The story of the British pound sterling as the world's reserve currency is really the story of the British Empire itself, and it begins, fittingly, with gold. In 1816, Britain formally adopted the gold standard, legally fixing the value of the pound to a specific quantity of gold. Anyone holding a Bank of England note could, in theory, walk into the bank and exchange it for a set weight of the metal. This was not just a technical monetary decision, it was a statement of confidence, a declaration that British money was as good as gold, literally. And for much of the 19th century, that confidence was justified. Britain was the world's largest economy, its largest trader, its largest creditor, and its largest source of foreign investment. The City of London was the global center for insurance, commodity markets, and international banking. British capital flowed to every corner of the planet, funding railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, plantations in India, and ports in China. And every one of those transactions was denominated in pounds sterling. The pound's dominance was reinforced by the sheer scale of the British Empire. At its peak, the empire covered roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and governed about a quarter of its population. Colonial economies were integrated into a sterling zone, where trade was conducted in pounds, reserves were held in pounds, and financial disputes were settled in London. For the countries within this system, the pound was not just a currency, it was the currency, the only one that truly mattered. But there was something else that made the pound uniquely powerful, something beyond military might and colonial reach. London offered the deepest, most liquid, and most sophisticated financial markets in the world. A central bank could hold its reserves in sterling and invest them in London, earning interest in a stable, well-regulated market with a vast array of financial instruments. In an era when holding gold earned nothing, and when alternative currencies were often unstable or inconvertible, sterling offered both safety and returns. It was, as one historian put it, even superior to gold in this regard. The gold standard under British leadership created a remarkably stable international monetary system. Exchange rates between major currencies were fixed relative to gold and therefore fixed relative to each other. This made international trade predictable and relatively frictionless. A merchant in Hamburg could quote a price in sterling, knowing exactly what it was worth in marks, francs, or lira. The system was not perfect. It could be brutally deflationary during downturns, and it offered little flexibility to governments facing domestic crises, but it worked, and it worked primarily because the world trusted the pound. By the end of the 19th century, the pound sterling was not just a currency, it was an institution. Central banks from Tokyo to Buenos Aires held their reserves in sterling. International debt was issued in sterling. Commodity prices were quoted in sterling. The very concept of sound money was synonymous with the Bank of England and the gold sovereign that stood behind. If you wanted to participate in the global economy, you did business in pounds. There was simply no alternative that offered the same combination of stability, liquidity, and institutional trust. And then, in the summer of 1914, a series of gunshots in Sarajevo set off a chain of events that would shatter this elegant system beyond repair. Everything changed. The First World War was not just a military catastrophe, it was a financial one. The fighting was so ferocious, so expensive, and so prolonged that every major European power was forced to abandon the gold standard just to pay for it. Britain took the pound of gold 1914. Governments printed money with abandon, borrowed recklessly, and accumulated debts that would take decades to repay. Britain entered the war as the world's largest creditor nation. It emerged as one of its largest debtors. The financial center of gravity, which had been firmly anchored in London for over a century, began to shift across the Atlantic to a young industrializing nation that had spent most of the war supplying food, oil, munitions, and machinery to Europe, and getting paid handsomely for it. The United States had created the Federal Reserve in 1913, giving itself a modern central bank for the first time. Its economy was already the largest in the world by the time the war began. And during the conflict, America's international investment position reversed completely. It went from being a net importer of capital to a substantial international creditor. Foreign governments, desperate for dollars to buy American goods, began accumulating dollar reserves. For the first time, the dollar was a serious challenger to the pound, but the transition was not instantaneous. This is one of the most important and often misunderstood aspects of monetary history. Reserve currency shifts do not happen overnight. They are slow, messy, and deeply contested. After the war, Britain tried to restore the pound's former glory. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, put Britain back on the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. It was a decision driven by pride and nostalgia, an attempt to reclaim the monetary prestige that had defined British power for a century, But it was also a catastrophic miscalculation. The pound was now overvalued relative to the bettered British economy. British exports became uncompetitive, unemployment soared, deflation set in. Meanwhile, the dollar was gaining ground. Recent scholarship by economists like Barry Eichengreen has suggested that the dollar may have actually overtaken sterling as the leading reserve currency, as early as the mid-1920s, much earlier than traditionally believed. By 1928, the Federal Reserve Board estimated that roughly $1 billion worth of foreign central bank reserves were held in dollar-denominated assets. The dollar and the pound were essentially sharing the role, coexisting in an unstable duopoly that satisfied neither side. Then came the Great Depression. In 1931, a wave of bank failures and speculative attacks forced Britain off the gold standard for good. The pound plummeted. Central banks that had been holding sterling reserves suffered enormous losses. Many scrambled to liquidate their foreign currency holdings entirely. The share of foreign exchange in total global reserves collapsed from about 36% in 1929 to just 8% by 1932. The international monetary system had effectively shattered. What followed was a decade of chaos. Countries erected tariff walls, devalued their currencies competitively, and retreated into economic nationalism. International trade collapsed. The resulting economic misery, historians widely agree, helped fuel the political extremism that led directly to the Second World War. By 1939, the pound was regaining some ground against the dollar as a reserve currency. Some data even suggests it was clawing back market share. But then the war began, and Britain's financial position deteriorated with terrifying speed. The cost of fighting Nazi Germany consumed what remained of Britain's overseas assets, its gold reserves, and its financial credibility. The United States, once again safely removed from the physical destruction, became the arsenal and the banker of the Allied cause. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces were storming the beaches of Normandy, the outcome of the war was becoming clear, and a group of economic planners had been working for years on a far less dramatic but equally consequential battle: the design of the post-war monetary order. The story of Bretton Woods is at its core the story of two men and the empires they represented. On one side was John Maynard Keynes, the towering British economist, aristocratic, brilliant, and representing a debtor nation clinging to the remnants of imperial prestige. On the other was Harry Dexter White, a short, bespectacled American Treasury official, blunt, aggressive, and representing the world's largest creditor nation and its most powerful economy. Both men understood that the pre-war monetary chaos had to be replaced by an organized system. Both believed in fixed exchange rates. Both wanted to create international institutions that could prevent the competitive devaluations and trade wars of the 1930s. But their visions diverged sharply on the question that mattered most: whose currency would sit at the center of the new system? Keynes proposed something radical. He envisioned a new supranational currency called the Bancor, managed by an international clearing union that would function as a kind of global central bank. The Bancor would not belong to any nation. It would be a neutral unit of account used to settle international trade balances. Surplus countries, those exporting more than they imported, would be penalized just as much as deficit countries, preventing the kind of imbalances that had destabilized the pre-war system. Keynes imagined a system with $26 billion in liquidity, enough to keep global trade flowing smoothly even during downturns. It was elegant, it was visionary, and it was never going to happen. White's plan was far more modest in ambition, but far more advantageous to the United States. He proposed an international monetary fund, seated with a finite pool of national currencies and gold worth about $8.8 billion. Countries would peg their exchange rates to the dollar, and the dollar alone would be convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. In White's vision, the dollar was not just another currency in the system. It was the system. For 3 weeks in July of 1944, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The hotel was elegant, but remote, surrounded by forests and mountains, deliberately chosen to keep the delegates focused and away from distractions. Many of the delegates had sons fighting in the war, and the emotional weight of the moment was immense. The negotiations were dominated by the American and British delegations. Other countries participated, but the real battle was between Keynes and White. And it was a battle that Keynes, for all his intellectual brilliance, was destined to lose. Britain needed American money desperately. The war had gutted its economy, depleted its reserves, and left it deeply indebted. Keynes could argue, persuade, and dazzle, but he could not overcome the fundamental power imbalance between a debtor and a creditor. In the final hours of the conference, a seemingly minor but profoundly consequential change was made to the agreement's language. The wording was shifted from pegging currencies to gold to pegging them to gold and United States dollars. With that quiet alteration, the dollar was formally installed as the anchor of the global monetary system. The Bretton Woods Agreement established three pillars of the post-war economic order. The International Monetary Fund would oversee exchange rates and provide short-term financial assistance to countries facing balance of payments problems. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later part of the World Bank, would fund post-war rebuilding and development. And the dollar, backed by gold, would serve as the reference point for every other currency on the planet. Congress passed the Bretton Woods Act in July of 1945. Britain's parliament ratified the agreement later that year as a condition for receiving a desperately needed American loan that Keynes himself had bitterly negotiated. The pound sterling, which had ruled international finance for more than a century, was formally relegated to second place. Keynes, exhausted by years of wartime work and the grueling negotiations, died in April of 1946. White's fate was scarcely better. His influence within the Treasury disintegrated under President Truman. In August of 1948, just 3 days after testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee about alleged ties to Soviet intelligence, White died of a heart attack. The two architects of the modern monetary order were both gone within 4 years of their creation. The Bretton Woods system worked, and it worked remarkably well, at least for a while. The post-war decades saw the most sustained period of economic growth in human history. International trade boomed. Western economies rebuilt. The system of fixed exchange rates provided stability and predictability that encouraged investment across borders. Historians call it the golden age of capitalism, and the dollar was its foundation. But the system contained a fatal flaw, one that an economist named Robert Triffin identified as early as 1960. For the dollar to serve as the world's reserve currency, the United States had to supply enough dollars to the global economy to meet the growing demand for reserves and trade settlement. But the only way to do that was to run balance of payments deficits, sending more dollars abroad than it received. Over time, this meant that the stock of dollars held by foreign governments would inevitably exceed the gold reserves backing them. The promise to convert dollars to gold at $35 an ounce would become a fiction. By the late 1960s, exactly this was happening. The Vietnam War and President Johnson's Great Society programs were driving massive government spending. Inflation was rising, the trade deficit was growing, and foreign governments, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, were quietly converting their dollar reserves into gold, draining American vaults. De Gaulle even sent a French naval vessel to New York to physically collect gold from the Federal Reserve. By 1971, the pressure was unsustainable. American gold reserves had fallen dramatically, the dollar was clearly overvalued, and on the evening of August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on national television and announced what he called a new economic policy. He imposed a 90-day freeze on wages and prices. He slapped a 10% of surcharge on all taxable imports, and he suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. It was supposed to be temporary, it was permanent. The gold window was closed. Foreign governments could no longer exchange their dollars for gold at any price. The anchor that had held the Bretton Woods system together for nearly 3 decades was gone. History calls it the Nixon shock, and it fundamentally altered the nature of money itself. And what followed was a period of turmoil. Exchange rates floated freely for the first time. The dollar weakened significantly. Inflation surged through the 1970s. The price of gold, freed from its $35 peg, began a dramatic ascent. And yet, against every prediction, the dollar did not lose its status as the world's reserve currency. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire story. The dollar survived the end of its gold backing because the infrastructure of trust beneath it was bigger than gold itself. The United States still had the world's largest economy, the deepest capital markets, the most liquid government bond market, and a legal system that foreign investors trusted. When central banks needed to park billions of dollars during a crisis, there was simply nowhere else to go. United States Treasury securities could be bought and sold quickly in enormous quantities at transparent prices around the clock. No other market on earth offered that combination. The dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, money whose value derives not from any physical backing, but from trust, habit, and institutional depth. And that trust, built over decades of economic dominance, military power, and financial innovation, proved remarkably durable. But here is the part of the story that should keep you up at night. Every single reserve currency in history, everyone, from the Spanish piece of 8 to the Dutch guilder to the British pound, was considered permanent by the people who used it. The merchants who traded in Spanish silver in the 1600s could not have imagined a world without it. The bankers who held sterling in the 1800s believed the pound would reign forever. And yet every one of those currencies eventually lost its dominant position. Not through a single dramatic event, but through a slow erosion of the foundations that supported it. Debt, overreach, war, the rise of competitors, the loss of manufacturing advantage, the weakening of institutions. The pattern is striking in its consistency. Reserve currency status lasts on average somewhere between 80 and 110 years. The dollar has held its position since roughly 1920, depending on how you count. That puts it right in the historical danger zone. Today, there are signs that the process might be beginning again. The dollar share of global reserves has been declining gradually for 2 decades, from over 70% at the turn of the millennium to roughly 58% today. The euro holds about 20%. The Chinese yuan, despite its limitations, is slowly gaining ground. Central banks in Russia, China, India, and the Gulf states have been accumulating gold at record rates, diversifying away from dollar-denominated assets. New payment systems are being built that bypass the dollar entirely. And the aggressive use of financial sanctions, particularly the freezing of Russian central bank reserves in 2022, has prompted many countries to ask a very uncomfortable question. If the dollar can be weaponized against us, should we really keep all our eggs in that basket? None of this means the dollar is about to collapse. History teaches that reserve currency transitions are glacial, not sudden. They happen in basis points, not in headlines. The dollar still has enormous structural advantages, deep markets, rule of law, the sheer inertia of a system built around it over 8 decades. There is no single challenger ready to replace it tomorrow. But history also teaches that no advantage is permanent. The Spanish believed their silver was inexhaustible. The Dutch believed their financial innovations were unmatched. The British believed their empire was eternal. They were all wrong. The real lesson of the 5 centuries before 1944 is not about any single currency. It is about the nature of trust itself. Reserve currency status is not a right. It is a privilege earned through economic strength, institutional credibility, and responsible governance. And it can be lost the same way it was gained, slowly at first, and then all at once. The dollar was not always the world's currency. And if history is any guide, it will not always be. The only question is what comes next, and whether the transition, when it comes, will be orderly or catastrophic. Because the last time the world changed its monetary operating system, it took 2 world wars and a global depression to get there. That is the stakes of this conversation. That is why this history matters. And that is why the story of what came before the dollar is not just an academic exercise. It is a warning. If you found this valuable, take a moment to like and subscribe. It is the single best way to support the channel and make sure you